But I want to move really quickly because I want to try to give you my big take on a very big question, which is why is there something rather than nothing? I'll probably be trying to do too much, but I'm going to plow through it and hope to leave you some time for questions. This question is, of course, a venerable one. It's been around a long time. There have been recent books by some philosophers of physics, cosmologists, popularizers of science, and lots of philosophers have written on the topic recently and not so recently. These are some old books. Of course, the question is an ancient and honorable one, and most philosophers have had something to say about it. And many have tried to turn it into an argument for the existence of God. The basic form of this argument, at least the form of the argument that the version I'm going to be most interested in, goes like this. There must be an answer to the question, and the only answer, or the best available answer, involves God. So, why is there something rather than nothing? Must have an answer. All attempts to answer the question that don't involve God are no good, so the best potential answer involves God. That's one way to understand the kind of cosmological argument that lots and lots of people have put forward in the history of Western philosophy. Now, I'll be surveying these various answers that are supposed to not be very good, criticizing them in the way that people do when they give the cosmological argument. Now, you should note, though, that even if the question must have an answer, and even if God is the best candidate, the conclusion isn't going to be a knockdown argument for God's existence. At least, that's what I'm going to say at the end. Still, it's not trivial either if this turns out to be correct. Okay, so let's think about what are good answers to the question, why does this or that thing exist? And then we'll think about the question, why does anything at all exist? A good answer is going to be a story of some kind. A story meaning a bunch of claims. A story that explains why this thing, whatever it might be, had to exist. So, why does this table exist, this podium? Well, there's a story to be told about that, about people putting together the parts of it and where those parts came from. It might also be a story, instead of being a story that sort of deterministically tells you, given these conditions, there had to be a table. It might just be a likelihood kind of story. It might be a story that says, given the conditions prior to its existence, it was very likely that the podium would come into existence. Either one, I take it, is a pretty good answer to why does this or that thing exist. And then a good answer to the question, why does something exist rather than nothing, is going to be a story that explains why something or other had to exist, why it was very likely that something or other would exist. Now, I'm going to set aside certain kinds of things. For instance, if the cosmos is all this physical stuff that's around us, if we have immaterial souls, these things are very interesting things. But suppose none of those things had existed and there were just numbers or sets. The empty set, for instance, and then the set that contains the empty set alone, and so on. If you study set theory, you'll learn about that. It's kind of plausible that even if there hadn't been souls and physical stuff and so on, those things would have existed anyway, because 2 plus 2 still would have been 4. That's a statement about numbers, so there would have been numbers. But numbers are really boring if they could exist all by themselves without any physical objects or souls. And if your answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing, it's just, well, there still would have been numbers. Okay, those things might be things that had to exist no matter what, but they're really dull. So let's distinguish between the boring things that can't cause anything to happen, and interesting things that can cause things to happen. And I'm going to take the really interesting question, why is there anything rather than nothing at all, to be really the question, why are there any interesting things? let's think about one very interesting thing, our cosmos. And what I mean by the cosmos is all this stuff, and by that I'm just sort of pointing around here in space, and anything or any place that you could get to by tracing any combination of connected paths in space and time from this stuff, including paths forward and backward in time, and also anything that's causally related to anything or any place that's mentioned in 1 and 2. So basically, anywhere that you can get in space and time from here, or anywhere that you can get by a causal path from here. Think about the DC multiverse. For those of you who are familiar with the DC comics, you know that there are other Earths, or there used to be, before the crisis on Infinite Earths. But the DC multiverse used to consist of a whole bunch of parallel worlds. That's how, DC would buy properties like Shazam. So suddenly Shazam is now a DC character. If you look at the comics, though, in a lot of them, it looks like Shazam did not coexist in a world with Superman. All of a sudden, Shazam is in the same world with Superman. And, how does that work? Easy. There are parallel worlds, right? There's one where Shazam and Superman both exist, and there's one where just Shazam exists. Actually, Shazam is Captain Marvel. Should get his name right. Well, these are not really distinct cosmoi. Each one is not a separate cosmos, in my sense, because in the DC multiverse, they have a common origin, and the characters can interact. And, really bad guys can try to destroy a whole bunch of these, like in the Crisis. So the DC multiverse is just one cosmos. You can get from one of these universes to another. There's causal relations between them. So it's a kind of a multiverse, but it's not what I mean by a multiverse, by a real multiverse. This is the view that there's more than one cosmos. The different cosmoi are island universes that are spatiotemporally and causally isolated from one another. Now, I'm interested in them because the hypothesis that there's a real multiverse is going to show up as a potential answer to why is there something rather than nothing. Our cosmos or a multiverse containing it would be a very interesting thing, or it would be made of interesting things, because the stuff in these worlds causes other stuff. All right. The kinds of stories that I'm going to consider, really the only kinds of stories that there can be, that would serve as answers to the big question, are contingent stories and necessary stories. So I need to explain a little bit about necessity, possibility, and contingency. And it's useful to talk about possible worlds. Now, possible worlds may just be useful fictions, but they're useful nevertheless. Think of a possible world as a complete set of conditions, a complete way that things could have been. It's like a complete book of the whole world. The book might be a fiction, but it's consistent. It could have been true. So it's a big book, and it says the way that everything is. Now, if in fact we live in a multiverse, then the big book of the world that describes how everything is describes all the stuff in our cosmos. It also describes the stuff that happens in the other ones, the ones that we can't get to. So a possible world can be a multiverse. It's one book, a very big book, but it's got chapters for the each different cosmos has a chapter. So that's what a possible world is, a complete way that things could be. And that helps, I think, understanding what it means to say that a statement or a claim or a story is necessary. It means that the statement or the claim would have been true under any conditions whatsoever. That is to say, there's no possible world in which it would have been false. Possible statements or claims or stories are ones that could have been true. There's at least one possible world in which a possible statement or claim is true. Statements or claims are contingently true. They are true in at least one possible world, but there's also at least one possible world. They're contingently true if they're actually true, and there's at least one possible world in which they could have been false. So let's think about some of the stories that could answer the question. They're going to come in two types. There's contingent stories, according to which a contingent truth explains why there is something interesting rather than nothing. And there's going to be necessary stories. On these necessary stories, you can point to some necessary truth that explains why there is something interesting rather than nothing. Another distinction that's going to be important is a distinction not between stories, but between kinds of things. There are necessary things and contingent things. Necessary things, if X, whatever, God, the universe, whatever, the number 2, if it's a necessary thing, that means it's necessarily true that it exists. It exists in all possible worlds. So for every story about how things could have been, it's going to say X exists, if X is necessary. Contingent things actually exist, but they didn't have to. So it's not necessarily true that one of these things exists. So although a contingent thing exists in the actual world, it doesn't exist in every. The null world. Sounds like it comes from the comics as well, but the null world is the possible world in which there are no interesting things whatsoever, whether contingent or necessary. Now, is the null world really possible? That's one of the big questions at issue here. In a sense, the big question with which we started, why are there any interesting things at all, is the question, why not the null world? Why isn't the null world the case? Okay, so the driving force behind the cosmological argument in the form that I'm going to consider it is what's called the principle of sufficient reason. Now, really, there's a whole bunch of principles. It's a whole family of principles. And there's a lot of good books you could read about the principle of sufficient reason. Alex Proust has a nice book on a whole bunch of different versions. The one I'm going to use says this: for anything interesting that exists, there has to be some kind of story, contingent or necessary, that provides a true explanation for its existence. Nothing interesting can exist as a matter of brute fact. All right, so here's the plan. We'll start out with a brief consideration of the idea that there is no answer to the question. It doesn't really need an answer. Principle of sufficient reason is false. And then we'll look at contingent stories, and then we'll look at necessary stories. And we'll rule out a whole bunch of contingent stories and some of the necessary stories. And we'll end up with just a nice God story. Okay. That's an inside joke. All right, so why accept the principle of sufficient reason? Why not just say there's no answer? In that case, it would be a brute fact that something interesting exists, and it doesn't have any further explanation. Well, first, I have to say, it is not obvious that there is anything wrong with saying that there's no answer. The best I can say is something like this. We do generally suppose that the existence of some interesting things has a causal explanation. And so the principle of sufficient reason seems like a prima facie true principle to be given up only if we discover A, that there isn't even a good candidate for being an answer, or B, that none of the good candidates remains plausible in light of everything that we know. Yeah, and in fact, at the end of the day, the best answer isn't even going to be a causal answer. So really the assumption here has to be we generally suppose that there's some kind of explanation when you have an interesting thing, something that can cause other stuff to happen. So the structure of the argument is there must be an answer. The best one involves something like God. So we're going to rule out a whole bunch of others. So we'll come back to the no answer thing at the end. Let's first look at some contingent stories. I'm going to divide these up into attempts to give a kind of scientific explanation for why there's anything at all, and then some more philosophical explanations, and then the hypothesis of an infinite past. Recently, Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking have pushed different kinds of contingent stories that would seem to provide or are billed as providing scientific explanations of why there is anything at all. anything interesting. Krauss's has this sort of structure: redefine nothing so that a physical something or other qualifies, and then point out how that physical something or other could produce everything else. Doesn't sound very good, and I don't think it is very good. But he has a second strategy, and that second strategy is actually borrowed from Stephen Hawking, so we'll turn to that as well. And on that strategy, you posit laws that just say that something is likely to exist. Krauss, in his book, A Universe from Nothing, says, I'm not very good at PowerPoint. Okay. All right, got it. He says that there's this process that we have a really good reason to believe exists, namely inflation. A process that's thought to have happened shortly after the Big Bang, in which the universe grew rapidly in size. And he points out that quantum theory allows for a field that counts as, in a sense, empty space, or a vacuum. And it counts as that because it doesn't have any particles in it. But it can nevertheless have enough energy to give rise to a universe that's not empty, that's not in a vacuum state, but that's full of matter. So here's a quote from the book. Observable features of the universe are strongly suggestive that our universe arose through a process like that of inflation, a process whereby the energy of empty space, nothing, gets converted into the energy of something. Well, the problem with this, a problem that's been pointed out by David Albert in a scathing review in the New York Times book review, the problem with this is that the nothing isn't really very nothing-like. A relativistic quantum field theoretical vacuum state, no less than a giraffe or a refrigerator or a solar system, it's a particular arrangement of elementary physical stuff. Albert is a philosopher at Columbia, but he's got a PhD in physics, and he knows what he's talking about. And Lawrence Krauss, if you read far enough in his book, Something from Nothing, you discover that he's well aware of this, and he admits as much. So later on in the book he says, well, it would be disingenuous to suggest that empty space endowed with energy, which drives inflation, is really nothing. Empty space is complicated. It is a boiling brew of virtual particles that pop in and out of existence in a time so short we cannot see them directly. So he admits that he's pulling something of a bait and switch. The nothing that he appeals to is a particular arrangement of physical stuff, as Albert puts it, and it may explain where the rest of the universe comes from, but not where it comes from. And surely it, this boiling brew of virtual particles that spits up our universe and others as well, is a contingent thing. It didn't have to exist. So the speculative physics that Krauss tries to use seems to be a contingent story about something, about some stuff. And so it really hasn't explained why there is any interesting stuff at all. But Krauss then refers us to Hawking, the Hawking-Hartle model of the universe. And Stephen Hawking makes use of the Hartle-Hawking model in a way that would seem to provide an answer to the question, why is there anything interesting at all? And I believe it takes this sort of structure. Posit laws that say something is likely to exist. So Stephen Hawking starts out with a very strong statement here. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? Why this particular set of laws and not some other? Some would claim the answer to these questions is that there is a God who chose to create the universe that way. We claim, however, that it is possible to answer these questions purely within the realm of science and without invoking divine beings. How? Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Now, how does this explanation go? Well, it appeals to this Hartle-Hawking model. Hartle and Hawking develop a theory about the laws of quantum mechanics and gravity, and they show that it allows for a certain kind of universe, the possibility of a certain kind of universe, one that has a finite past, but its appearance out of nothing doesn't violate conservation laws. That's the important thing about the Hartle-Hawking model. So you might think that something coming out of nothing would violate the conservation of energy, but there is a theory of quantum gravity, they say, they describe it, that allows for universes that have a beginning and have a net energy of 0. If the laws of that theory of quantum gravity were true, the appearances of universes with beginnings would not violate the conservation of energy. So that's the important thing that their model shows. Okay, so far so good. But they claim something further about what is shown by the possibility of universes obeying such laws, at least Hawking does. He says, if the laws of that theory of quantum gravity were true, the appearances of certain kinds of universes would be possible, even probable. So in effect, the proposal is there's a contingent law of nature that says it is very probable that a universe will appear without anything causing it to come into existence. And this is to explain why there is something rather than nothing in terms of some kind of law of nature. And here, I think Albert's point is still valid. Physical laws take the existence of some elementary physical stuff for granted, and they tell us how it can be arranged. Laws are rules about possible and impossible arrangements of stuff, rules connecting earlier arrangements to later arrangements. So they take something for granted and they tell us how you get other stuff from that. So merely positing a law that says probably there are universes of this type described by the Hartle-Hawking model is not a kind of law that can really explain why something should come into existence. So if Albert's right about the nature of laws, then this is not a good sort of explanation for why there's anything interesting at all. So those are the only scientific explanations I'm going to consider. One of the weaknesses of this kind of argument is it's an argument by elimination. So who knows, perhaps someone will come up with something better. But let's look at some philosophical explanations that take a similar sort of form. Derek Parfit, one of my colleagues actually, he supposes that the universe might be kind of special, and it might have a feature that makes it look special, a selector, which sounds like a kind of superhero. Mortal enemy of indecisive man and wavering woman. But suppose that the actual universe is the biggest possible world. That would be a good candidate, he thinks, for being the selector, or maybe the best possible world, or the worst possible world, or the world with the neatest laws, or something like that. The list could go on. He thinks a selector explanation could go like this. The world has some unique sort of feature. It's having that explains why it's actual, and boom, there's your explanation. Here's how it would work with the biggest, or rather the best. Let's take the best. Suppose the actual world is the best. He thinks if it is the best, that might be the explanation of why it's actual. Okay, so could that explain why it exists? I think not, and I think not for a similar reason to the previous case. Here, Swinburne puts the objection like this. Parfit suggests that there might be axiomatic principles. For instance, it's good that something good exists. It ought to exist. And these principles somehow produce events because it is good to do so. But there are no plausible example of such principles at work in the world. When food appears on the tables of the hungry, it does not appear there because it is good that it should, but because some person, a substance, caused it to be there because that person thought it was good that it should. So the problem here with both the scientific and philosophical explanations I've been looking at is that they explain the existence of something in terms of a contingent law or principle. But a contingent law or principle to really explain the existence of something has to describe the powers or activities of some other existing thing, but then the existence of that thing needs an explanation. So either we're left with an uncaused thing, or there's a series of causes that go back with no beginning. On a contingent story, an uncaused cause would have to be contingent. Given what I just said about how laws explain, it could not be explained by a law or principle. So an uncaused contingent thing at the back of all the other contingent things would leave us with no answer to the question, why is there anything at all? The only remaining contingent story then would appeal to an infinite series of contingent things, each causally explained by others. Okay, so both of those seem to fall prey to this problem about the way in which laws or principles can explain. Now, what about the idea that, well, there's just always been stuff, contingent stuff, interesting contingent stuff, and so long as every member of the series of contingent things going back has a causal explanation, then the existence of the whole series is explained. Hume's principle says as long as every member of the series has an explanation, then the whole series is explained. All right, so is that a good explanation? Does it explain the existence of everything? Well, William Lane Craig has claimed that that's not a good explanation because you couldn't have an infinite series. A collection formed by successive addition, he says, cannot be actually infinite. The temporal series of past events is that kind of collection, so it couldn't be actually infinite. He's got two arguments against that. I'm not convinced by these arguments. Maybe some of you have heard of Hilbert's Hotel. It's got infinitely many rooms in it. And if it's full, the proprietor can always make room by asking everybody to move down one, and then you can always get as many more people in as you want. That sounds paradoxical, but I don't think it's so bad. Craig says that's just too weird to be possible, and what it shows is that infinities are impossible. Well, you know, if you have an infinite series of squares going in both directions, and there was a person on each square, everybody could take a step to the left. It doesn't strike me as all that crazy. And Hilbert's Hotel is really no different than an infinite series of squares where everybody can just take a step to the left. It's just you're leaving off half the people. So I'm not convinced that the past couldn't be infinite. So we have to take this hypothesis seriously. Samuel Clarke, a generation before Hume, argued that Hume's principle just seems to be false. Suppose one contingent thing causes another, which causes another, and so on. If the series of causes has no beginning and it always stays within the collection of contingent things, there remains the question, why does the whole series exist? Why these things? Why, they didn't have to exist. If you had a bunch of green bug-eyed monsters and each had been produced by an earlier generation, you could still ask, why any green bug-eyed monsters? So it seems like if the series of causal explanations just stays within the contingent things, you haven't really explained why the whole series exists. So if that's right, then contingency stories are not going to give us an answer to the question, why are there any interesting things at all? Because we've sort of ruled them all out. Okay. So let's turn then to some necessary stories. And I think the necessary stories, that's where we get some really interesting ideas. Some necessary stories say there exists one or more necessary things, and they're interesting things. Other necessary stories do not. Although the story may be necessarily true, it's just not a story about necessary things, it's a story about contingent things. These kinds of stories take two forms. Some of them say necessarily something or other exists, but there's no particular thing that exists. Or they might say necessarily it was likely that something or other exists. Let's take the first kind. Necessarily something or other exists, but not anything in particular. This could be put by saying the null world is not really possible. Here's the main objection to this kind of view. It's the objection that contingent things should be subtractable one from another. If you've got a number of things that exist, you should be able to describe a possible world that simply deletes any one of them without adding more things. If there's a world with a finite number of contingent things, then successive subtraction leads to a world with no contingent things. So if you have a story that says there are no interesting necessary beings, the possible world with no contingent things is just the null world. If the null world is possible, then this necessary story is false. So I think subtractability suggests that this is not a good answer to why are there any interesting things. So that takes us to the idea that necessarily it was likely that something or other exists. And this is something I really don't know what to say about. The idea is the null world was very unlikely, so we should not be surprised to find that the actual world is not the null world. Earl Coney has pressed this. He says, look, think of all the possible worlds. If the null world is really a possible world, there's only one null world, because there's really only one thing, one way for there to be no contingent and no interesting things. But there's infinitely many other possible worlds with interesting things, so the odds are in favor of a world with contingent things. Since this fact about the number of null worlds, 1, compared to the number of non-null worlds, infinitely many, is a necessary truth, this is a necessary story. The only thing I can think of to say to this is to say, well, look, not every possible world is equally likely. Compare a world with 2,371 laptops, all the fish in the sea, 3 boots, and that's it. Weird, complicated. How could the fish exist without, a sea, and so on? There's all just this conglomeration of bizarre things. Compare that world with one that just has 2 electrons, they appear and they go off forever, and that's it. Well, that second world is simple, it obeys very simple laws, the things that appear are very simple, and isn't it just more likely than B? Isn't B just weird? I mean, rather the other way around. Wait, A's got the fish and the laptops, right? Okay, A is much less likely than B. Simpler hypotheses are more likely to be true, other things being equal, a point that Richard Swinburne has emphasized a lot in his arguments for the existence of God. So, shouldn't we say the null world is the simplest world of all, and therefore, prior to making any observations, it should be judged the most likely to be the case? I'm not so sure about that, but it's a thought anyway. Let's put a bunch of big question marks there and move on quickly. Necessarily, it was likely that something or other exists. We'll leave that behind and look at necessary stories about necessary things. This strategy was described by William James by saying some forms of being have been deemed more natural, so to say, or more inevitable and necessary than others, and so can sort of explain themselves. So could there be interesting things that are necessary? And if there were, could there be an explanation why anything interesting, including the necessary thing or things, exists? A worry that you might have, reasonably, is just saying an object is necessary or a thing is necessary doesn't explain why it exists. After all, there are derivative necessary things as well as non-derivative necessary things. Plausibly there are, anyway. More derivative things depend upon the less derivative things. A more derivative thing is nothing over and above the less derivative ones. They exist because the less derivative things are arranged a certain way. So if God necessarily thinks certain thoughts, those are necessary but derivative. They depend on God. If you've got a set that has necessary things in it, it exists necessarily, but it exists because those things exist necessarily, and set theory is necessarily true. So derivatively necessary things exist in virtue of necessary facts about necessary things. But could there be derivative necessary things all the way down? Turtles all the way down, as it were? If not, then you've got to have non-derivatively necessary beings, and those are sometimes called self-existent beings, and arguably they should succeed in explaining themselves. If it's in the nature of a thing to be so-and-so, then the thing had to be so-and-so, and if you understood its nature, you'd see why it had to be so-and-so. So if it's in its nature to exist, then it would explain its own existence, at least in principle. Maybe we can't understand the explanation, but if there are such beings, they would explain themselves. So, let's look at two strategies for explaining the existence of the cosmos, our cosmos, using interesting non-derivatively necessary beings. First strategy, suppose that the necessary being is made out of the stuff in our cosmos plus the stuff in other parts of the universe, if this is a multiverse. This would be a kind of pantheism or panentheism. There's a necessary thing, it's made out of this stuff. It contains it all as among its parts. And the other strategy is suppose that the necessary being is, or is distinct from, but able to cause the stuff in our universe. And the most familiar example of this would be some kind of God. Here's an example of the second strategy, the greatest possible being. Not pantheism, it's a thing that's not made out of this stuff, it explains its existence. The world as a whole, that was an example of that first kind of strategy, the sum total of all the interesting things. These are better strategies than, for example, the 32nd, 25th, and 6th members in the list of the greatest possible beings, sort of committee of gods, saying those things are necessary and they explain everything else. There's something wrong with that hypothesis. Similarly, there's something wrong with the hypothesis that the world as a whole prior to 1965 is a necessary thing and everything after it is contingent but caused. You know, even though 1965 was, by my lights, a great year, I won't explain why, but you can guess. It's implausible to say that there's something special about those years. It's like saying that only the integers and 0.8 are necessary. All the other numbers are contingent. There's something wrong with that. There's something wrong with thinking that only certain sets of numbers are necessary and not others. So here's a test for plausible necessary existence I'm going to propose. If X belongs to a family of very similar, seemingly possible objects, X can be necessarily existing and the rest of the family not, only if X is strikingly different from the others in some way. Otherwise, all should be necessary or none. And that's going to put a kind of constraint on the necessary stories we can tell. So the world as a whole, the sum total of all the necessary, or rather the sum total of all the interesting things, that's not so bad. The world as a whole prior to 1965, not so good, because there's all these other things, the world that, the stuff ending in 1975 and so on. The greatest possible being, distinct from the universe but capable of explaining its existence, that's a pretty good hypothesis. The 32nd, 25th, and 6th in the list of greatest possible beings, they are the necessary ones and they caused everything else. That's not so good. Why? Because there's all these possible beings and different groups of them are not very distinct from one another. So this is going to put a constraint on these two strategies and rule out some versions. I think what it leaves us with is the sum total of everything is the best answer using the first strategy, and the greatest possible being is the best answer using the second strategy. But these are examples. There are other proposals. Let's think about that first strategy and the case where we're talking about the sum total of the universe. Remember the subtractibility argument. If everything interesting is contingent, then there could have been no interesting things. For this first strategy, this pantheist strategy, to work, at least something in the physical universe must be necessary, perhaps the whole, perhaps a part or parts. When we apply the test for plausibly necessary beings, we look at those parts of the world that are necessary can't be just like other parts that are not. So it's got to be some unique, interesting part of the entire big contingent thing. So maybe everything in this possible world is necessary, or all the fundamental particles, or just the initial state. When you think about how big the world is, whether it's a real multiverse or not, the alternatives turn out to be kind of implausible. Suppose that our world, the possible world that's actual, just says this cosmos exists and nothing else. Then this would be like Spinoza's hypothesis. Every little detail of our cosmos is necessary, all the appearance of contingency is a sham. There couldn't really be a possible world different from this one. That seems to fail the test for plausible necessity because there's so many seemingly possible but similar universes. And I think that's why when people give versions of this view today, they avoid Spinoza's conclusion by saying many universes exist. A multiverse exists. John Leslie has one such view. He says the best multiverse exists, and that's a matter of necessity. David Lewis says every possible universe exists. The biggest world does seem like a pretty good candidate for a necessarily existing thing. Now there's a caveat here I'm not going to go into about, does Lewis really say that it's a necessarily existing thing? Basically, I think the answer is he should say yes. Okay. Well, I'm skeptical about these kinds of views. They say, in effect, the universe, the world that there is necessary in all its details and is really much bigger than we thought it was. So let's set them to one side and think about this other strategy. Suppose the necessary being is distinct from but able to cause the stuff in our universe. Now there's a lot of strategies you could use here, not just the greatest possible being. But whatever we propose, we should apply the test for necessary beings. Is it sufficiently strikingly different from other seemingly possible things that resemble it? Now I'm running out of time here, conveniently. And I'm just going to say the greatest possible being who caused everything else to exist, that's a pretty good candidate. It's very special. If there could be such a thing, it ought to be necessary. It would sort of explain itself. Here's some people: St. Anselm, Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, Al Plantinga, and so on. They've discussed this character, the greatest possible being. And if such a being is possible, it is significantly different from all other possible beings. Being best is a way to be special. There's other potential necessary causes, the maximally great rational agent. Maybe that's just the same guy. The greatest possible being, the greatest possible rational agent, maybe those are really two names for the same being, and these aren't competing hypotheses. But in any case, when we're thinking about the range of potential necessary stories, the potential necessary stories involving necessarily existing beings need to be tested for how unique or special are the individuals that are posited as necessary. And I think greatest possible being is a really good candidate. Of course, you could argue there couldn't be a greatest possible being, and there's interesting arguments for that. William Rowe has given some, and they deserve consideration. But if they can be answered, that's a pretty good story. All right, so let me sum up. What do I think? So this is confessional moment. Why is there something rather than nothing, something interesting? Well, I do agree that a conception of the world that provides an answer to this question is better, more plausible than one that does not. And I've said the answers divide into contingent stories and necessary stories. I've argued that all the contingent stories are failures, at least the ones I know of. That leaves the necessary stories. I left a big question mark hanging over Earl Coney's suggestion, and that needs to be thought about. But setting that aside, the best necessary stories either say implausibly that this universe, this actual universe, just this one, this cosmos, is necessary in all its details, or they posit a necessary being that caused everything else. I should say either they posit this universe as this cosmos as necessary in all its details, or they posit a multiverse, or they posit a necessary being that caused everything else. And I think the most plausible candidates for a necessary cause in that last category resemble traditional conceptions of God. Is this a killer knockdown argument for the existence of God? I don't think it is. I don't think it comes close to that. For one thing, it involves eliminating a lot of candidate necessarily existing causes. So even if God is the best hypothesis, it might not be more likely than the disjunction of all the alternatives. Think about a marathon. The odds on the favorite to win a marathon might still only be 1 in 20 or 1 in 100, even if there are even if that runner is very fast, so long as there are lots of runners. The runner might be much more likely than each of the others, but still have a small chance of winning. In this case, what we have to think about is David Lewis's multiverse as a necessary thing, the spinozistic single universe as a necessary thing, other kinds of potential necessary causes, Neoplatonic kinds of necessary causes that aren't really theistic, where there's something, someone, and it overflows and generates contingent stuff. There's a whole bunch of other stories, necessary stories, that do not involve the greatest possible being conceived of as a godlike entity. And those have to be taken into account. A second reason that this isn't a killer knockdown argument is that it's only as strong as our impulse to say there has to be an explanation for the existence of any interesting things at all. It's just not always true that where there's an itch, there's a way to scratch it. Is it worthless then? No, I don't think so. I think if a conception of the world is better with an answer than without, then having an answer is a good thing. It makes that conception of things more likely to be true than it would otherwise be. It's a bit of evidence. And having the best among the available answers is even better. And I think that's about the best that the cosmological argument could do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. We do have time for some questions, and I think Leah has, great, excellent. Leah will come around with a microphone if anyone has any questions for Dr. Zimmerman.
That was a whirlwind tour of the cosmological argument.
Thank you so much for coming today. Okay, so you were talking about the null universe of one of the possible multiverses. Do we have any idea what the other kinds of multiverses could be like within the sea of all of them? Like, is there any prediction?
Well, so the null world isn't really a multiverse because if it's a genuine possible world, it's got no interesting things in it at all. So if a real multiverse is possible, then presumably there's one with our cosmos in it, or one just like it, and other ones that are just slightly different. So let's suppose our cosmos is just an isolated thing. It didn't arise due to inflation out of some previously existing field, but it's like the Hartle-Hawking universe. It's closed. One multiverse would include this, plus some others with slightly different initial conditions. Those would be true multiverses. A universe that has a common origin and lots of regions that become disconnected, that's not a multiverse in my sense. But if multiverses are possible, then presumably every way you could have a space-time that's complete and whole, you could have that plus some others. And the biggest multiverse just has every way you could have a cosmos. And one hypothesis, David Lewis's hypothesis, is that our best theory about everything is that all of those exist. Well, that would certainly explain why this one exists.
So, sorry, you talked about Krauss, and you essentially said that his theory was contingent. But my question is, like, putting that theory of the greatest possible being, could you not say that his semantics of what is nothing aside, could you not say that like having nothing in a particular arrangement is just as necessary as the greatest possible being? I would think that might be intuitively nicer to say that although the greatest possible being just always exists and there's no causal result, and just intuitively having it created for that purpose might be better. But couldn't you make a particular arrangement of nothing on the same principle level as the greatest possible being?
Okay. So if we sort of take his first definition of nothing, where you could have a very complicated field that is in a state where there aren't really particles, and that is in a sort of ready state to generate universes. One thing you could say to get a necessary story out of this is to say, and by the way, that field I told you about exists as a matter of necessity, and so explains itself. If you could understand what it's really like in and of itself, you'd see why it has to exist. So that would be a necessary story. And I think you just have to compare it to other similar stories and see, wait a minute, does this seem like a good candidate for being a necessary truth? And the problem with it is I think it violates that principle I articulated about necessary things. If you've got a whole bunch of descriptions of field types, and they're all very similar to one another, but you take one and you say, bang, this is the one that's necessary, that's not very plausible because there's all these very similar ones. If there was something special, unique about it, then it wouldn't be so crazy to say it's necessarily existing. You know, in a similar way, there's something implausible about saying this cosmos exists and by the way, it's necessary. And it's not so crazy to say every which way that there could be a cosmos, every one of those, they all exist. Well, there's something kind of special about that possible world. So I think it's hard to turn Krauss's story into a necessary story.
Hey, there was a point in your presentation when you were talking about simple arguments being more reliable, and I was just wondering what exactly even qualifies as a simple argument and why those should be more persuasive than any other argument.
I didn't quite, could you say the first thing again? There was a point where I said what?
If I remember correctly, there was a point in the presentation when you were discussing how more simple arguments for the explanation of the cause of the universe are the ones that are more trustworthy.
I see. Simpler hypotheses are better.
Correct.
Okay.
And I was wondering what even qualifies as simple in the first place and
Yeah.
why those should be more persuasive than others.
Well, this is a very controversial principle, how to understand it. I mean, there's some sense in which everybody kind of agrees, Occam's razor-ishly, that, simpler hypotheses are better, or hypotheses that posit less stuff are more likely to be true. You don't want to say this PA system works by electricity, and also there are gremlins that are shouting the words and generating the same sounds, so the sounds are overdetermined. You don't need the gremlins; you just leave them out. So there's something better about hypotheses that posit less. One interpretation of what that betterness is that it's a matter of simplicity, that there's some kind of measure, an objective measure of the theoretical simplicity of competing hypotheses. And I guess I'm agreeing with Swinburne that we do make judgments about those kinds of degrees of simplicity, and that our ability to use evidence and so on depends upon judgments about these prior probabilities, and that simplicity is part of the story. But that's a big, it's a big can of worms that you're opening. You're right about that.
What is the most viable evidence for God, and what led you to be Christ following?
In the 30 seconds remaining, boy, I need more water here. Have you seen the Marx Brothers movie where Harpo is asked a question, and Harpo's, is the one that doesn't talk, so he just keeps drinking more and more water. Yeah, I think that when you've got some really big, life-altering conviction, people are going to believe it for a lot of different reasons. And some of the reasons that one person has might not work for somebody else. Why not? Because they have different views about how probable this is or that is or the other thing is. And they might not be irrational in doing so. So an argument that works for one person might not work for another person, and it might be that neither one is malfunctioning in some way. For me personally, the cosmological argument would not be an argument that would, push me over the edge for the reasons I've suggested. It seems to me it can be part of a Richard Swinburne-style cumulative case argument, where you've got a whole bunch of different arguments, each kind of raises the probability of theism a little bit, and eventually maybe pushes you over to 0.75 or something like that. I forget exactly what number Swinburne's arguments arrive at, but some people do arrive at belief in God in that sort of way. I would say that I have not, though I do think seeing a cumulative case like that can bolster one's degree of belief. I think religious experience is a potent and important source of religious belief. It certainly is for me, and perhaps it depends a bit on the day of the week too, which things that I believe most support the conviction that God exists.
We have perhaps time for one more quick question. If anyone wants to squeeze the last question in. There's a hand. There's a hand over that way.
You talked about how the different possibilities for necessary being, like the greatest possible being or the most rational being. Is there reason to believe that some of those have to be the same being, like it's the greatest possible being? It also has to be the greatest rational being?
So there have been plenty of attempts to argue from greatest possible being to greatest rational agent, or something like that. So the famous versions of the cosmological argument that you find in Aquinas and Leibniz and Samuel Clarke, they conclude that there's a necessary thing that's responsible for all the other stuff, and then they say that being has to have the attributes that we associate with God. And these arguments generally go by way of great-making features. A thing is better if it's all-knowing. A thing is better if it's all-powerful. A thing is better if it's rational than if it's not rational, and so on. And I think these arguments are pretty good. I mean, what they depend upon is our supposition that as you go up in greatness beyond us, the things in question are going to still be rational agents. They're still going to be things to which we can attribute intellect and will. And of course, that's the thing that pantheists deny. That's the thing that a Neoplatonic conception of the one would deny. There's maybe something like will, something like intellect, but you can't really say that the one is an agent. So I think these arguments are pretty good, but they depend upon supposing that as you go up from us, the better and better things are still going to have intellect and will.